Naomi Ashford mended the fingertips of her own gloves in her lap, right through the sermon, so the pews behind her would never see the bare thread of them. 3 years a widow. Every Sunday the same. Her needle moved small and low, hidden in the folds of her skirt, while the preacher spoke of loaves and fishes. The brass plate on rear pew number 9 still read Ashford. She was certain now she could no longer pay to keep it, and not once, not one time, did she look at the floor. At the yearly meeting, Deacon Wicket read the arrears aloud, name by name, the whole hall listening. And from a front pew that cost $14, the merchant Tobias Crane said it low, but meant it to carry. A widow ought to sit where a widow can afford. 41 families heard him. The Monday she came to give the pew back, the deacon closed the book on her hand. It's paid, Mrs. Ashford paid, clean through spring. And has been these 2 winters. He did not say by whom. If you believe it's never too late for the heart, this story is for you. If a story like this moves you, subscribe and comment the town you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this one travels. Now let me tell you the rest. Piedra Blanca, New Mexico Territory. The year was 1884. The kind of town where the wind came down off the mesa and found every crack in every wall, and where a church stood at the center like a promise the desert kept trying to break. Naomi kept a spotless adobe on the east edge of town, swept twice a day, whitewashed every spring. She took in mending, and she was good at it, the best hand with a needle for 40 miles. She had married Thomas Ashford at 19. 22 years they had. Then the fever took him, and the quiet moved in where he used to be. She still rose before the light. She still earned every meal she ate. In 3 years of widowhood, she had never once taken a plate she hadn't paid for with her own work. That was the thing about Naomi. You could pity her later, if you wanted. But first you had to love her. And loving her was easy, because she asked for nothing. Now, you have to understand how church worked in a town like this. The pews were not free. Not the good ones. Every winter the front pews went to auction, sold to the highest bid, and the family that won put its name on a brass plate and screwed it to the wood. Crane's plate, the banker's plate, the cattleman's plates, shining up front where the light came through the colored glass. Behind them came the rented pews. $3 the year. A modest sum for a modest place, halfway back, where the ordinary families sat. And behind those, at the very rear, the free benches. Bare wood. No plate, no name. The place you sat when you could no longer pay to sit anywhere else. There was a book. The pew book. It sat on the deacon's table by the door, and in it, in Amos Wicket's careful hand, was written every family and every sum they owed. Who had paid? Who had fallen behind? And once a year, at the congregational meeting, the ones who had fallen behind were read out loud. The seat was the number the whole town read off you. Where you sat on Sunday told everyone exactly how you were doing, rising or sinking, holding on or letting go. And pew number 9, with Ashford on the brass, $3 the year, was the last thing Naomi had that still said the Ashfords were a family that paid its own way. She meant to keep it. God help her, she meant to. But Thomas had left more than silence. He had left a note at the Drovers and Merchants Bank of the territory, $260, borrowed against the adobe and the 2 acres behind it in a bad year, and it was coming due. The first Monday after Easter. Naomi did the sums at her table by lamplight, over and over, the same way she checked a seam. And the numbers never changed. Her mending would cover the note, if she was careful, if nothing broke and nobody got sick. Or it would cover the pew. It would not cover both. So she made her decision the way she made all her decisions. Quietly, and alone, and before anyone could make it for her. She would let the pew go. She would slip back to the free bench at the rear on her own 2 feet, head up, before a single soul in Piedra Blanca could say the word for her. Better to walk to the bare wood herself than be sent there by a ledger read aloud. Across the aisle from pew number 9 sat a man named Elias Rourke. A widower, a rancher, late in his 50s, weathered brown, quiet as a stone in a field. He never spoke to her. He tipped his hat to no one in particular and kept his eyes low. There was a hymnal on his bench that wasn't his, a woman's hymnal, worn soft at the corners, and he never opened it. His people, if you asked the oldest folks in town, had once sat on the bare benches at the rear. Years back. Nobody remembered it now. Nobody thought of it at all. Remember that. Set it down somewhere and leave it. We'll come back for it. Now, a strange thing had begun to happen, and Naomi had noticed it without letting herself think on it too hard. The rear door of the church had an iron hinge that screeched. It had screeched for years. Every time she came in late, and she was often late, catching up the last of a job before the Lord's Day, that hinge announced her to the whole congregation. Every head would turn a little, every eye would find her, coming in behind everyone else, and she would feel the heat climb her neck. But sometime that autumn, the hinge went silent, oiled, smooth as butter. She could slip in now, and no one turned at all. She thought it was the sexton, of course. Who else would it be? Some small kindness from a man whose job it was to keep the building. She was grateful, in the vague way you're grateful for weather that holds. She never asked. It never occurred to her to ask. The sexton had not touched that hinge. But we'll come back for that too. Tobias Crane had begun to court her. And Crane did nothing quietly. He was a prosperous man, a merchant with a store on the plaza and a fine coat, and he had decided that the widow Ashford would make a respectable wife. So he set about it the way he did everything, out loud, in front of God and everyone. He had a pew reserved for her at the front. His pew. He mentioned it where others could hear, and he made it known to the deacon and to the ladies and to anyone who'd stand still that he intended to settle the widow Ashford's affairs, to clear whatever she owed. To do it, he said, so that all could see it done. His generosity came with his name pinned to the front of it, bright as the brass on his plate. Help you couldn't miss. Help that made sure you saw the helper. Naomi did not encourage him. But she did not quite send him off either, because a poor widow does not have the luxury of many doors, and she was too honest with herself to pretend otherwise. Then came the meeting. The whole congregation packed into the hall on a cold night, 41 families, and their coats and their breath fogging in the lamplight. The pew book lay open on the table. And Deacon Amos Wickett, an honest man, honest to a fault, a man who believed that reading the ledger out loud was the same thing as justice, began to read the delinquent list. Naomi sat with her mended gloves folded in her lap. She had come prepared to hear her own name. She had rehearsed the face she would wear when it came, the calm, the small nod, the walk to the rear bench she would take the following Sunday as if it were her own idea. She was ready. She waited for Ashford. And Crane's voice came across the room, low and meant to carry. A widow ought to sit where a widow can afford. A few men chuckled. A few women looked at their hands. Wickett read on, name after name. The Pierces. The Coulter boys. Old Mrs. Danforth, 2 years behind. He read them all, in his careful, terrible, honest voice. He did not read Ashford. Naomi sat very still. She waited for it at the end, thinking he'd saved it, thinking there'd been an order to it she hadn't caught. But the deacon closed to the bottom of the page and set down his pen and moved on to the next order of business. Her account stood clear. Her cheeks went hot, hotter than shame would have made them, because she knew, to the penny, that she had not paid it. She had the $3 still knotted away at home, meant for the note, and she had not carried a cent to that pew book. And yet her name stood clean on the page, while poorer names than hers were read aloud to the room. An error, she told herself. It had to be an error, a slip of the deacon's pen. And she said nothing, because to stand and correct it was to make herself the center of the very thing she'd spent 3 years avoiding. But the mercy sat worse in her than the list would have, to be passed over, cleared by a hand she couldn't see, when she had steeled herself all night to stand and take her medicine. It shamed her in a way the bare bench never could have. A debt she hadn't paid was a debt she couldn't see the shape of, and Naomi Ashford could not abide a thing she couldn't see the shape of. That night, she lay awake and turned it over the way she'd turned the numbers. Someone had done this. Someone had reached into the pew book and made her whole without asking her, without telling her, without so much as a word across the aisle, and whatever else it was a thing she had not answered for with her own 2 hands. By morning she had decided. She would go to the church herself. She would surrender pew number 9 outright, give the seat back clean, and she would put her own $3 on that table and settle whatever stood against her name, so that nothing at all, stood in that book that her own hands had not answered for. She would not be carried, not by an error, not by a stranger, not by Tobias Crane. She had walked into her widowhood on her own feet, and she would walk through it the same way. What she did not know, what not one soul in Piedra Blanca had told her, was that the rent on pew number 9 had been carried in quiet every Monday before the book was read. 2 winters running. Paid each quarter by a hand that had asked, most particularly, to stay off the page. So on Monday morning, Naomi tied $3 into the corner of a handkerchief, and she put on her mended gloves, and she walked to the church to buy back her own dignity and give the pew away. She did not know it yet. But that walk, that small stubborn refusal to be carried, was the very thing about to break the secret wide open. The deacon's table stood just inside the door, the way it always had. Amos Wickett was already there, sleeves pushed back, the pew book open before him. Naomi laid the handkerchief on the wood and worked the knot loose. $3. Her own $3. "I've come to give up pew 9, she said, "and to settle what stands against me. All of it." Wickett did not reach for the coin. He looked at her a long moment. Then he turned the book around so it faced her, and he set his finger on the column. "There's nothing to settle, Mrs. Ashford. It's paid clean through spring." He moved his finger up the page. "And it has been these 2 winters." She looked where he pointed. Entry after entry, quarter by quarter, in a hand that was not hers. $3. $3. $3. 2 winters of them, marching up the page like fence posts. "That's a mistake," she said. "I never paid those." "No, ma'am, you didn't." He closed the book, gently, careful of her fingers on the edge. He bought the seat. "And never once sat in it." "Who?" Wickett folded his hands. He was an honest man, honest to a fault, and honesty was pulling him 2 ways at once. "The one who paid it made me promise you'd never have to thank him. I gave my word, Mrs. Ashford. I mean to keep it." She walked home not knowing her own street. 2 winters, somebody had sat in this town, Sunday after Sunday, and paid her way and asked for nothing, not even the small warmth of her knowing. It should have felt like grace. It felt like a hand on the back of her neck. She began to read it off faces. Tobias Crane came to mind first. Of course he did. A man who reserved a front pew for her before she'd said yes to anything. When she passed his store, he tipped his hat and let his eyes go soft, and when she said, careful as stepping on ice, that some kind soul had been good to her, he did not deny it. He only smiled. "A man does what he can for a lady," he said, and let her think it. What she could not see, what the whole town saw and never said, was Elias Rourke slipping out the rear door before the last hymn every Sunday, so she'd never pass him in the aisle. Tipping his hat to his own boots, never her eyes. He had paid for her seat and kept his own bench across the way, and he crossed nothing to reach her. Nothing at all. The deacon let one thing slip. The once. She'd gone back to press him, and he'd said, more to himself than to her, "It's happened before in this church." 30 winters back. Same kind of hand. Kept a family off the bare bench and never gave a name. He caught himself and said no more. But the seed was in her now, and she didn't yet know whose family it was, nor whose hand had done the keeping. Then the bank's rider came. He nailed the notice to the post outside the mercantile where all could read it. The note at the Drovers and Merchants Bank. $260. Due the first Monday after Easter, or the adobe and Thomas's 2 acres passed to the bank. Her home. Thomas's ground. Printed on a board for 41 families to walk past. Crane came to her that same week. He did not kneel. He stood in her doorway with his hat in both hands and made it plain. "Marry me, Naomi. I'll clear the note before the whole town. You'll never want again. You'll never sit at the rear of anything again." And here is the terrible thing. She nearly took him. Not for love. To escape. If a poor widow was going to be carried by one man's hidden money and another man's public money, then let her at least choose the currency. Let her pay her own way in the only coin the world offered her. She would marry Crane and be announced and be done with being a secret on somebody's ledger. She was halfway to the wrong life when Elias Rourke stopped her on the church road. He'd never spoken to her. Not once in 3 years. Now he stood square in the road with his hat off, an old woman's hymnal worn soft in his big hands, and he would not let her pass. "You mean to marry him to pay a debt," he said. "It isn't yours to pay." "And what would you know of my debts, Mr. Rourke?" "Everything." He turned the hymnal over and over. 30 winters back my father was broke. Broken behind on the Rourke pew. Deacon meant to move us to the bare bench, and my father was a proud man. It would have killed something in him to be moved off in front of everyone. Then the rent got paid. That winter and every winter after. No name to it. My father died never knowing who kept his standing for him. He lifted his eyes to her at last. I learned the name years on. It was Thomas Ashford. The road went very quiet. Somewhere, a dog barked and stopped. "When Thomas died," Elias said, "and I saw his widow start to slip toward that same bare bench, I took up the seat. It was his debt to be honored, not mine to press on you. I stayed across the aisle because that's where a debt belongs. I never meant you to know at all." The annual meeting fell the next week. The pew book lay open on the deacon's table, and the 41 families filled the benches, and Tobias Crane rose before the arrears could be read. "Before the deacon begins," Crane said, warm and easy, "I'll say plainly what most of you have guessed. I've had the honor of setting the widow Ashford's affairs in order. Her account stands clear by my hand, and she and I have reached an understanding." He turned to her, expecting her face to seal it. Deacon Wickett stood up. "I'll not have a lie written into my book, Tobias, nor spoken over it." He set his hand flat on the ledger. "The Ashford rent was paid 2 winters by a hand that asked to stay unnamed. And it was not yours. I keep the entries. I'd know your money." Crane's smile came apart at the corners, and into that silence, Elias Rourke stood up from his bench across the aisle. He did not look at Naomi. He looked at the room. 30 winters ago, the Rourkes were near put off the pew we couldn't pay for. A stranger paid it, and never said his name. My father died, not knowing who saved his standing. He drew a breath. It was Thomas Ashford, and when Thomas was gone, and his widow was near slipping toward that same bare bench he'd once saved my father from, I paid her seat the way he'd paid ours. That's all it was. A debt to a good man. She never knew. She was never meant to. You could feel the whole hall doing its arithmetic. 3 years of Sundays, every glance ever aimed at rear pew number 9, all of it recalculated, in one long breath. She was not a charity case. She was not a kept woman. She was the widow of a quietly great man, a man who had paid in secret before either of these suitors was grown. Crane sat down slow. Every kindness he had ever done wore his own name stitched across the front of it, and now the whole town could see the stitching. His suit was finished, and he'd finished it himself, reaching for the credit. The first Monday after Easter came, and Naomi answered the note with her own 2 hands. The churchwomen had put up a fair, and they'd commissioned her needlework at a named price, coin she'd earned stitch by stitch. And when Wickett pressed the bank's clerk on the ledger, a payment Thomas had made years back turned up, misapplied, folded into the wrong column. Between the two, the 260 was met. She counted it onto the clerk's counter herself and took the receipt in her hand and read it twice. Free, owing no man for her roof. That spring Elias went out to Martha's stone with the worn hymnal that had ridden his bench for years. He stood a while. Then he did the thing he had not been able to do. He let it go. Not into the ground, into Naomi's keeping, to ride to church in her hands now. Martha would not mind. Martha had never minded a kindness in her life, and Naomi's own release was quieter and larger than his. The man who'd come to love her had grown straight up out of her husband's buried goodness. Loving Elias took nothing from Thomas. It finished something Thomas had started 30 winters back and never lived to see bloom. So the Sunday came when Elias Rourke crossed the aisle. Only now, when she owed him not 1 cent, did he cross it. He came and sat down in rear pew number 9 under the brass plate that still read Ashford, and the whole town that had read her poverty off that number for 3 years watched a poor widow become a chosen wife. Not carried. Chosen. There is a world of difference, and every soul in that room could see it. On his way in, Crane had passed close. Naomi didn't rise to it. She only said, quiet and dry, folding her mended gloves in her lap, "You'd have paid it out loud, Mr. Crane. That was always the trouble." The following winter a drifter family took the rear rent and fell behind by Christmas. The deacon opened his book to read the arrears and found the sum already settled. Paid quiet, before the reading. By a hand that had asked to stay off the page. Naomi kept her own bench across the aisle from those strangers, so they'd never have to turn and thank her. The grace had come to her invisible, and she passed it on the same way, hand to hand, no name on it. That is the whole of it. Dignity is not the thing you are handed. Dignity is what finally stops being announced about you. If this one reached you, tell me the town you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far it travels. The drifter family had 3 children. Naomi could see the backs of their heads from where she sat, 2 boys and a girl. The girl in a coat that had been let out at the hem and let out again until the stitching gave up trying to match. Naomi knew that coat. She had worn its cousin for 2 winters of her own, turning the cuffs to hide the thin places, smoothing the collar each Sunday morning in front of the small mirror in the hall. You learned to carry it as though it were deliberate, as though you'd chosen the simplicity yourself. The father held his hat in his lap through the whole service. His wife did not remove her gloves. Naomi did not look away from the pulpit, because looking was the thing she would not do. She remembered what it was to sit in a room and feel every eye that chose not to land on you. The careful mercy of the averted gaze that still announces itself. She kept her own eyes forward and her face the same as any other Sunday, and that was the whole of what she could give them this morning. Ordinary. She made herself ordinary beside them, which is its own form of grace. Elias's hand found hers somewhere after the second hymn. Quiet, with no announcement. The way he had always done a thing, she was coming to understand. Not toward the room. Toward her. His thumb moved once across her knuckle and was still. The brass plate on the end of the pew caught the winter light that came low and thin through the south window. Ashford, she had studied that plate in grief and in shame, and in something she could only now name properly as gratitude. It said one name, and that name belonged to a man who had paid a debt 30 years before he knew he was paying it, for a son not yet born who would one day need it, and who would one day return it, quietly, to a woman not yet widowed, in a church not yet understood, under a winter sky the color of old pewter. That was Thomas. Still arranging kindnesses from wherever the good ones go, she held Elias's hand and watched the light move on the plate and let her husband be proud of her, the way she believed the dead are sometimes allowed to be proud of the ones they loved well and left behind.